Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
And this week, we're on tour. In fact, we're in Palm Beach, Florida, just down the road from Mar-a-Lago, where a certain incoming president lives. And we're here to interview a great friend of ours and a great friend of Britain, the presidential historian Alvin Felzenberg. We'll be discussing with Al the relationship between American presidents and British monarchs, including the impact their relationship has had on the special relationship between our two countries. We'll also be asking which US presidents were the favourites of British monarchs. But first we begin with a segment called Matters of Interest, where we discuss something we've read, watched or listened to that we found particularly interesting. So Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, as we're in Florida this week, I thought I would make my matter of interest about something to do with this state. And in particular, I wanted to look at the election results in Florida in November. Now, in addition to voting for president and for members of Congress, many Americans also had the chance to vote on different referendums and ballot initiatives in the different states. Voters in 10 states had questions regarding abortion rights, and voters in 6 states had questions regarding the legalization of marijuana, cannabis. And Florida was just one of 2 that had both questions on the ballot. And I thought it'd be interesting to look at the political geography of those ballot initiatives. And if you look at the political geography of those ballot initiatives in the state of Florida, you can see that the pro-cannabis position far outruns the pro-choice, the pro-abortion position in the north of the state. But in the south of the state, it's reversed. So if we take, for example, Dixie County, so rural, white county, very pro-Trump. Trump won 85% of the vote in that county. Cannabis legalization lost by just 6 points, whereas the pro-choice, pro-abortion position lost by 40 points in that county. But if we take Miami-Dade County in the south, much more urban, diverse, much more stronger Latino population, cannabis lost by just 1 point, and the pro-abortion position won by 17 points, and this county also voted for Donald Trump by 11 points. So Trump was able to win rural white conservatives, but also a good chunk of voters who were in more urban and diverse parts of the state, including some voters who voted to protect abortion rights and also voted for Donald Trump. Now, on the other side of the coin, there was one county in the whole state where Kamala Harris did better than the pro-choice position. And that county is Gadsden County in the north of Florida. And Gadsden County is also Florida's only majority African-American county. So black social conservatives, black voters who were skeptical of abortion rights, were still voting Democratic. And one of the great questions moving forward for American politics is, will black conservatives continue to vote for the Democratic Party, or will they defect to the Republican Party? So Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, sticking to the American theme, it's Inauguration Week here in the United States, and that's very much what lots of people are talking about. The transfer of power, peacefully this time, from one president to another, from Joe Biden to Donald Trump, giving effect, of course, to the election result that took place just over 2 months ago. And that's a marked difference from the United Kingdom. We, of course, have a transition of power, but in our case, it just takes a couple of hours. An incumbent prime minister often travels from their constituency count back to number 10, then to Buckingham Palace, and they're gone. All before lunchtime the day after polling day. It's a really brutal and rapid transition of power that we have back home. The downside of long transitions, like I think we've seen here in the United States, and probably as America is seeing at the moment, is the relative powerlessness of the sitting president and the sense of a rival court around the incoming president. In quiet times, this might be okay, but when disasters strike, as arguably we're seeing with the Californian wildfires and the response to them, I think it can be very problematic. But short transitions have their downside too, not least that no matter how much incoming governments claim to be prepared for office, they simply aren't. They're almost totally focused on getting into government before the election and worry much less about what they'll do afterwards. I think that's even true about the manifesto writing process, which is usually more of an attempt to say what's required to get you into office than a genuine blueprint for what you will do when you get there. I think we've seen that in particular about this new Labour government that we have at the moment, which hasn't really done all that much. What it has done has been very unpopular. And in part, I think that's down to the fact that it has no driving vision of where it wants to take the country that it can communicate. And I think in part that comes down to the fact that it wasn't particularly well prepared for government, and it had a lack of a plan for what it would do when it got there. It's impossible within Britain's constitution to adopt a long transition period, and nobody would really want it anyway. But it is worth us asking, I think, how can we back in the UK help incentivize opposition parties to really do the hard yards before they come into government so that they have a clearer plan and a clearer agenda? That's something which the very long transition periods here in the United States clearly affords incoming governments and incoming administrations. Whether they use it or not, of course, is a very different question and not something we have back home, but it's certainly a comparison it's worth us thinking about in terms of how we can be better governed.
And now let's move on to our special guest, Al Felzenberg. Alvin Felzenberg is a presidential historian, political commentator, and former public official. Al holds a PhD in political science from Princeton University and has lectured at the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington University. He was also a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy Institute, which I believe is how you first made your contact with Al. We were working out nearly 20 years ago, not quite 20, but getting
Yes.
closer to 20 than to 10. Al has served in 2 presidential administrations, was official spokesman for the 9/11 Commission, has been the majority senior staff of several House of Representatives committees, and also served as the Assistant Secretary of State of the state of New Jersey. Al is the author of numerous books with topics ranging from U.S. presidents to governors to conservative intellectuals. Well, thank you, Al, very much for coming on. We're
Thank you,
very
Rich
delighted.
Finlay. It's a pleasure
very,
to be
very
here.
delighted to
Thank
have
you very
you.
much.
So, Al, this is a podcast that is mostly about the history of Britain since the Second World War. But since we have you, I can't help but begin by asking you to reflect a bit further back, because I know that your expertise goes right back to the start of your country's history. And I'd like to know about the very first meetings of US presidents and British monarchs. So to begin, could you tell us about who was the first person who would eventually become president who met a British monarch?
Well, it would be John Adams when he was ambassador to the court of St. James. And George III was the king. And they both suspected that the king would be still upset at these troublesome colonists for breaking away. And the king's great regret was that they did break away in his time. He might have known of Adams a bit because Adams was the lead agitator at the Continental Congress for independence. It was his resolution. And they wrote a document signed by a friend of his then, Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, wrote the inflammatory rhetoric and soaring end to the Declaration of Independence, giving a mission statement for the war. Jefferson was stationed as ambassador to France. In the period between the end of the American Revolution, 1783, to the founding of the new government in the late 1780s, they had planned a country trip, a tour of British gardens, and the two of them traveled together. Whether Adams met the king previously to present his credentials, I don't know, but I know they were together. And the memory we have is the king was very silent. Adams, I believe, remembered that the king had sat the entire time with his back to them. And Jefferson thought he was a little bit gruffy, but they didn't exchange much. And it was a very short meeting. As you were introducing me, I just recalled that both Martin Van Buren, future president, and the future vice president under Andrew Jackson, and James Buchanan were both ambassador to the UK. Van Buren wasn't there very long. He was called back home to Jackson for political reasons. Buchanan remained, and people remember he did visit Victoria, Queen Victoria, spend some time at the palace with her, mostly in the company of other ambassadors and formal events. But one of the reasons he became president was he was abroad. and he was not directly engaged in the secession fight and the slavery fight. And everybody else the Democratic Party could dominate was either on the side of abolition or secession. So he was a safe bet one time. So that, in a way, that ambassadorship made his career.
So those are all people who the monarch will have known that were prominent figures, but not necessarily known that they would become president. Perhaps maybe one or two, they could have made a guess. But who was the first person who had served as president and then met a monarch? So the monarch knew, I have met a president of the United States.
Well, that was Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant was the general who won the Civil War. As ex-president, he decided finally he and his wife could travel. It had been their ambition from the time they were newlyweds. And there was always some war or some reason or some tragedy that kept them from doing this. He resolved that he was going to take a tour around the world with his wife, his 19-year-old son, former military aide to his, and a reporter. Marketing was even something then. Grant was one of the most admired figures in the world. He had preserved the Union. He had introduced a number of military tactics that have still become the method ever since. One of the things he's rather famous for, as Sherman gets a lot of credit for it, was we call it total war. And that is, how do you end a war quickly? Well, this doesn't sound very nice right now, but we're talking about warfare. You try to end the war quickly by extending the war's reach to the civilian population where you can. Will encourage the enemy to defect. It will create anxieties among them. It will diminish their farmland and space and raw materials. And it was used in World War II, as you know, in the case of Dresden. The Nazis tried it in the Battle of Britain to no avail, thank the Lord. But he was the most admired man for doing this, and very few people thought the Union had a chance to win at that time. So there's a lot of curiosity about him. Who was this man? How did he come up with the strategy that made Lincoln win the war? How was slavery ended? And then, of course, he's the president during a field you've written a great deal about during Reconstruction. And he was the last president to actually advocate the needs and hopes and aspirations of the newly emancipated slaves. And so everybody decided they were going to welcome him. So his first stop, he was taken to Manchester. Now, the entire diplomatic strategy of the Civil War was keeping the UK out of it, neutral. Now, if the British were to approach this as a war over how many nations should there be in North America, it's very hard to get too emotional about that. Are there going to be 2, 1, or 50? But when you say this is a human rights issue, and this will affect white workers in Britain as well as black slaves in America, and that they may be owned, but in many ways they have as much freedom or lack of freedom as workers in the factories at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The textile industry, of course, was dying to have raw materials to make dresses and shirts and other kind of garments and keep the British trade flow going. But if they could turn this into a cause for emancipation, there would be great pressure on the British government to stay out. And that's essentially what happened. Lincoln executed that policy through our ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, a grandson of the first American ambassador to the court of St. James. They take him to Manchester, where you reminded me at lunch, there is a statue of Lincoln to this day. Grant thanked the workers of Manchester for all their efforts on behalf of the Union. This was very important to him that he saw them before he went to the palace. Well, the next day or so, he's taken to London, and he's the talk of the town. Everybody's giving him a dinner party, and all the hostesses are competing for will he come to their party first and who will be on the invitation list. So as is often done in your country and mine, Gladstone gave him a dinner, Disraeli gave him a dinner, and the Literary Society of London gave him a dinner. Gladstone was very taken with Grant. He said he was a simple man, but a very smart man, and a man who knew his mission in life. Disraeli was more charmed at the beginning of the conference than at the end. He said he had respect for Grant's policies, but the more he's talked, the more he realized that he was a simple, backward American and he bored him. And Disraeli wrote that, so I left the party at my first opportunity after the meal. The literati took great to Grant. Matthewiano took a great liking to Grant. Trollope was there and had a great friendship with him. And several of the other writers of the period. I couldn't find any record of him meeting Charles Dickens, but I'm sure he was somewhere. He may not have come out for Grant, but he was living in London at the time. The monarch. You're waiting for, when is he going to get to the monarch? Queen Victoria offers to put up the Grants for an evening at Windsor. And doesn't go extremely well, but it tells in many ways more about Grant than about Victoria. They arrive. Mrs. Grant is immediately put off because all of the Queen's ladies in waitings tell her how she is to behave in the presence of the Queen and the court. Mrs. Grant gave it to them straight. Madam, what do you think I've been doing for the past 8 years except standing up at receptions? I know exactly how to behave in the presence of a queen or of you. Well, that isn't exactly a great opening line for the First Lady. They come into the Queen's table, and Grant has a 19-year-old son who's very curious about the world, worships his father, and it's his first time to travel with his father. He can't wait to get to India and China and the next places on their stop. He notices that, by the way, the party consisted of a military aide, as I may have said earlier, a traveling pressman, the son, and the Grants. And he notices that the Queen has set up a side table for all but the couple Grant, and that's it. And the traveling party are seated at a table with some minor servants. We would now call it the children's table. And this fellow was a university student at the time, and he was pretty precocious and curious. So he walked up to his father and asked if he could see him for a minute. And he said, we crossed a wide ocean and did great preparation for this trip. And we did not do this to sit at the servants' table. If we're not going to listen to the great affairs of state being discussed between the Queen and my father and you, Dad, I could have spent the evening with my companions, gone to the theater, gone to the concerts. Well, Grant basically told him to act like a good guest and sat at his table. The Queen inquired what this little ruckus was about. And of course, instead of saying, "Oh, that will pass, ma'am, no problem," no, he told her what it was about. And he said, "I'll also tell you, madam, that I think my son is right." Wow. So the Queen quite surprised everyone. She said, "Very well then." And she asked for a leaf to be brought out to the table. The table was expanded and they all dined together. There's no word of any further communication for the rest of Grant's life and the Queen's. When Lincoln died, this is very interesting. Victoria wrote a letter to Mrs. Lincoln and expressed the great sympathy and sadness of the American people. Mary Lincoln, not being known for being empathetic toward people with other problems, she had enough of her own, which we can talk about, sat down and wrote a very heartfelt letter to the Queen that no letter means as much to me as you, because I know you've been through this same tragedy in your life as mine. And thinking of you will help get me through this. It's an extraordinary letter that she wrote that.
Well, that's all fascinating now. And so that then leads us to the logical next question, which is, who was the first incumbent president to meet a reigning British monarch?
Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson pays his trip in 1919, the year of the Versailles or Paris Peace Conference, which will produce the Versailles Treaty. And the king was very excited to see him, but he didn't want him to come the day he was coming. He chose to come the Christmas week of 1918. And Lloyd George says to the king, I am very proud to be heading your government as your minister. It is therefore incumbent upon me to tell you, you are not spending Christmas in Sandringham. You're going to spend it at Buckingham Palace as the host to Miss President and Mrs. Woodrow Wilson and the American delegation to the peace conference. Wow, you can imagine how that went. The king, well, he was very gruff. Oh, he has a sense of humor, George Smith, but he could be very gruff. So gruffing, we shall go. We will welcome the Wilsons. Well, the British public is ecstatic. I mean, this man was going to be the man who had ended war in our time. Made the goal of the Allied mission, making the world safe for democracy. The king said, well, the British people are so interested in this, I will meet them at the station. And they sailed in, and they meet him at Victoria Station, and there's a carriage photograph of the two of them. Two carriages, one with Mrs. Wilson and the Queen, and one with the monarch and the president. Wilson was a lot of things. He was not a great conversationalist, and he was very devoid of humor. The king picked this up within about 2 seconds. And then what did I get myself into? He's all business, and he's all preaching. They exchanged the toast, and the king is very put off at the fact that Wilson went through an entire half-hour speech without once mentioning the sacrifices of the British Army, Navy, without visiting an American grave anywhere in Europe, without talking about the sacrifices of the soldiers. His rationale was he came here to talk peace, not to bring up the struggles of war and the tragedies of war, which we're going to leave behind us. Well, King saw this very differently. The king had served in the Navy. All his sons served in either the Navy or the Army in World War I. Some were wounded. He had visited them at the front, and it was something Wilson did not do. So that's where we take Wilson. But there was a member of the Wilson administration who captured the king's heart and could have even passed for an adopted son with George V. I don't know if he had 5 or 6 children. I think he had 4 sons and a daughter. I think I'm right. But if he had room for one more, that room would go to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was sent by Wilson to inspect the troops, to observe the battles, to write home, to lobby for more aid for Britain, aid for the men and the troops, aid for the trenches, more medical supplies. That's why he was sent, several fact-finding missions. And then he decided that he would report to the king what he found, which he did. They hit it off fabulously. And what did it was they were both fanatic stamp collectors. They spent hours over several evenings going over their famous finds and the various places that reminded them of and all the joys they get out of this hobby. And they stayed in touch. And you'll see in the King George's letters tremendous praises, like you would write toward a son or some of the son you wish you had. And maybe he did, given his relationship with the king that would follow him. But he would, I felt he could trade him in somewhere. But we get to George VI. And once again, warm memories that George VI had heard about Roosevelt from his father. Similar interests, naval background, love of history, many love of everything naval. And Roosevelt comes up with this idea. Now, you know about the Lend-Lease plan, which was the proposed plan through which the United States would find a legal way to give aid to Britain when the Congress was against it and the country was overwhelmingly isolationist. This is where the first time the phrase America first comes up, but what it means is take care of America only or America alone and turn your eye to the rest of the world. We've got these oceans to protect us. To add to that, you had the America First movement was fueled by the agricultural states, the farm states. Many of these states had been settled by veterans of the revolutions of 1848. They wanted to leave this in the old country. We came here to get away from war. We're not going to do this anymore. And freedom and liberty and all the things we talked about in 1848 were stuffed out. So we learned a lesson. We wanted to tend to our farm and go away. Then you had a substantial amount of Irish American immigrants. The Irish because of the issues going on between Ireland and England at that time, which will end in the early 1920s with Ireland as a free state, they wanted nothing to do with the king of the royalty. Roosevelt said, I've got to break the back of this resistance somehow. Oh, I should add, the American press, the American public fell in love with Edward VIII, and the love story about abdicating because he could not go through his duties without the support of the woman he loved. Remember, in the 20s, he also was the great athlete, the great fashion model. He was on the cover. He was somebody that people admired. You can argue for the right reasons, for the wrong reasons. And they couldn't understand why they threw him out, because they couldn't take a bride he liked. Roosevelt says, how do I get through this? This guy's been, king 3 years, learning the ropes, and he's got a world war on his neck that might break out any time. So we're going to invite them to a tour of the United States. And he's going to show off the British monarchy, this lovely young couple. Hard to remember the Queen Mom is a young couple. But yes, and they're going to show her off, take her to the great places of the United States, and use this as a great diplomatic adventure. Well, the first stop's Washington. I'm going to talk a little less as we go along. The first stop's Washington. They go out to Mount Vernon. They go to the Capitol, all the things the tourists do. Then Roosevelt says, I've added a special treat to your trip. You have a program that worked with young people, teaching them crafts and how to understand people of different social levels. I call it mine the Civilian Conservation Corps. I take unemployed but ambitious young men trying to help their country, and I'm giving them a job, and I'm giving them a place to live. And they're staying in military-style barracks, but they're going to plant trees all across this country. I was thinking the other night how many of those trees perished in the past week, California. I can't even tell you the millions of trees that were planted by these young men in this reforestation program that Franklin Roosevelt had done. That was to pull us out of the Dust Bowl. And so we're always trying to pull my country out of something. And hopefully we always have a president who sees it, sees the need for it. And the king's heart melts. And the queen says, isn't this like this thing we have at home? And yes, it is indeed. Tell me more. Tell me more. And so a correspondence starts, not just between them, but between the people running these programs. Well, they go to Columbia University and pick up an honorary degree. And they sail up the Hudson to Franklin Roosevelt's estate in Hyde Park. And the king decides he's going to show the American people, particularly German farmers and Irish beer drinkers, that they're just like everybody else except for the crown. Believe that sometime, and I'll buy you some dinner. Okay, he's going to show the American people this. So he decides he's not having a China dinner and not having French cuisine, not having a Jackie Kennedy kind of candlelight, white tablecloth. No, we're going to take them out to Mama's porch. Mama's Roosevelt's mother. And we're going to serve them hot dogs and beer. And of course, I can just imagine the king and queen saying, what is that? All right. Well, they get to talking and they decide they're more than just political allies. They really like each other personally. But of course, it's always matters of great state that are involved. Anyway, they go home. After the palace was hit in one of the blitzes, and they thought that there was a window for a while, Franklin Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, to spend time in the palace with the royal family. She went through the city inspecting the ruins and the bombings. She conveyed, this is our way of saying we are with you. We feel what you feel. And we're going to continue to keep this friendship alive. Now, as this moves along, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill will coin the phrase, the special relationship.
So I guess what happens over time is we have these occasional, quite sporadic relationships between monarchs and presidents. But some of the things that you touched upon, technology, the increasing ease of travel, and also, of course, the fact that Britain and America were side by side in 2 world wars, mean that the intensity of these relationships sort of goes up a great deal. And that, of course, really becomes the case under the reign of Elizabeth II.
Yes.
Of course, who becomes monarch when Truman is in the White House and dies when Joe Biden is in the White House. It's extraordinary
Yeah.
long reign, during which there are lots of interactions with American presidents. I think she meets every American president except for LBJ.
Mhm.
And in many ways, the way in which we think about that relationship between monarchs and presidents, it's quite easy to think of it as really what was the relationship between Elizabeth II and presidents. Because so much of the footage that we have, so much of the events that people recall were all sort of within her reign. So could you highlight a couple of the potentially most important relationships between the late Queen, Elizabeth II, and the American head of state?
I'll be as brief as I can. The king was scheduled, first of all, Franklin Roosevelt was scheduled to make a goodwill tour of Western Europe as soon as the war ended, and he had died. And Truman, on the way home from the Potsdam conference, decided that he would fulfill that obligation. George VI insisted on going down to the dock and escorting him up in the ship. And they had a very candid chat. They liked each other. It wasn't exactly the Roosevelt relationship, but they took each other well. And he was supposed to come to visit the United States in a few months, the king. He decided that he was ill and he just had some surgery, and he would ask that his elder daughter represent him. The White House was under construction, and Truman decided to greet Elizabeth in his library at Blair House, was across the street from the White House. Actually, Tony Blair stayed in that very house when Clinton was president, and he said to the press, "How nice of you to name a building after me." And one of the great lines.
Typical.
Well, it got a lot of laughs. And he said a few things. He said, "I'm the father of a beautiful daughter myself, and I hear you have another one at home. Bring her next time, by all means." That's the meeting. Eisenhower, you asked the favorite presidents of some of them. I would say early part of her reign has to be Eisenhower. Remember, he was a familiar figure in Britain. He may not have known her yet, but he was living there, and he was always in the news. And the living symbol of the alliance, planning the war effort, planning D-Day with Churchill and others right there. She makes another trip to the United States. Her first one, I mentioned that Truman was 48. She comes in 57, I believe, and Eisenhower goes all out for her. I mean, all of the generals of both sides are at the state dinner, all in their military regalia or wearing their military sashes and military honors, and went on for hours and expressing their appreciation. And he had a younger man, more of her generation than his, serving as vice president. That was Richard Nixon. He was in his early 40s at this point, and he becomes her official guide to Washington, again, which she'd already seen at least on one or two occasions. And there was a relationship that continued there. By the way, in St. Paul's Cathedral, there's a very small chapel dedicated to the memory of American soldiers who perished with their British brethren in the darkest days of the war. He dedicated that on behalf of the United States in 1958. And she was then his host at a state dinner at the American Embassy, and then reciprocated later on at the palace. And so they had a relationship that preceded his election by at least 10 years. And I probably should say that the Reagans managed to break through whatever the veneer was, or whatever the mist that Bagehot talks about that surround the monarchy. And the way through were through horses. She was a magnificent equestrian, and he loved to ride. His famous quote was, "And nothing is as good for the inside of a man as sitting on the outside of a horse." And he heard she was a magnificent equestrian. So he requested that they go riding in Windsor Park. And of course, I guess they did expect the entire press corps. Maybe they should have required them to come on horseback as well. But Reagan said, in his 70 plus years on this planet, he never saw a human being, male or female, in so command of a horse. That horse knew who the boss was. And that tells you a lot about the owner. And they continued to see each other. They did visit on private trips. She came to Kentucky a couple of times where she kept some horses. She kept to California. Late in his presidency, she did come out. She hadn't seen Yosemite. She wanted to see some of the national parks out west. And the president was supposed to have a dinner for her in Santa Barbara. They wound up on Britannia because of the monsoon storms. And that joke was repeated several times. The Queen stood up and said, "Mr. President, you told me that if Philip and I took this trip, you would do everything you could to make us feel at home. I think you might have gone a bit overboard." He enjoyed that very much. So she did very well. She was very popular here. And, my generation, she's the only monarch we know.
The current king has been a public figure, well, really since the 1950s.
Yes, since 1954, 5.
And therefore, he probably has also had an opportunity to interact with many of the first families that you've been discussing. I wonder if you look back at his long period of time as Prince of Wales, are there any particular interactions that Charles had with the president or a first family that you think is quite notable?
Yes, I'll mention at least 2. There are others, but I'm respectful of your time here. In 1970, he took a tour of North America with Princess Anne, and he stopped at the White House and had a marvelous series of conversations with Richard Nixon, whose forte was foreign policy. And there was all this talk in the air about common market and how will it affect America if there was a united Europe in some way, and various things. And of course, the talk was on the table. And, are we going to have a peaceful decade with Russia? Blah, blah, blah. Charles asked the president, or the president asked him, if there's anything I can do for you to make it a better stay. I don't know who asked the question, but he said he would appreciate a deeper briefing by the people who are working on these policies. So he would spend a few hours with Henry Kissinger, a few hours with the gentleman who William Ruckelshaus, who was the first director of the Economic Protection Agency Nixon had established, and a few others. And we got some confidence building and things of that kind. But on the trip to the United States, after he visited the White House, every young man's dream is to visit Hollywood and maybe meet some starlets. And the former American ambassador to the UK, Walter Annenberg, still, well, it's passed on, but remained a friend of the British people until the day he died. And you can see a stained glass window in his memory now in Westminster Abbey. He'd given the British people many, many tokens of his appreciation and affection from his years as ambassador. And he had a party at his ranch in Palm Springs. Of course, all the old timers of Hollywood of my parents' generation were there. I mean, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Bob Hope told everyone about his English origins. And at the dinner, wound up sitting next to the governor's wife. And it turns out to be Nancy Reagan. And they hit off a tremendous friendship that evening. I don't know what they talked about. But this begins a correspondence that runs for at least 20 years. And when Charles marries Diana, Mrs. Reagan was sent by her husband to represent the American people, but press didn't know the rest of it. And so why is she showing up all over London? Is she self-declining? Why does she travel with 20 suitcases? Is it an overnight bag enough for others? Right. On and on and on. Queen Nancy, they called her, blah, 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 blah. She attended, yes, as a substitute for her husband, but she also attended as one of the groom's special guests. And she attended most of the dinners that the groom's friends and family put on for him. And that continued till the day she died. And Sally Bedell Smith, who wrote a wonderful book on the Queen, she wrote a book about Prince Charles. And she managed to persuade Mrs. Reagan to let her have at least 7 pages of voluminous letters. So some of you, if you want to, can read them on your own.
I wonder, Val, just to wrap up on the monarchy and the presidency. What your thoughts are on whether or not this dual role, I guess, from the part of the United Kingdom, to have both a prime minister and a monarch who interacts with the White House and represents the country, whether you think the monarchy has added value to that special relationship between the UK and the US?
Well, it's added tremendous value because of the symbolism of the nation that is embodied in the monarch. No prime minister has had that. Maybe Churchill a bit because of his role in the war. But I guess most British people see the prime ministers, I won't say as the hired help, but they come and go. And they more identify with a party or with a philosophy than with the nation. Now, of course, if there's a crisis and one of your prime ministers would respond to a terrorist attack or God knows what, that would be there. But the Queen is a constant. And in her absence, the monarchy is a constant. And, the faults that have happened or the criticisms that can be raised have been because certain members of certain families may have lost their way along the way. But it's not a failing of the institution. The institution will survive. It survived civil wars. It survived many things, and it will survive this. And I wish we had right now, in the absence of a president, maybe we'll have one again who will have this, but who could speak for the nation and talk about the interests of the United States as opposed to the interests of a faction or a small group. We may get that back. But in the absence, there is a place to look for inspiration.
Well, thank you, Al, for that fascinating insight into the relationships between British kings and queens and American presidents. Many anecdotes and thoughts that will keep us wondering and positing about for a long time to come. So thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
We now finish with our final part of the episode where we talk about a book that we're reading at the moment or that we would like to recommend to our listeners. So Lee, why don't you begin?
Sure. My least patriotic opinion is that I prefer the way American publishers print their books to the way British ones do. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but American books have this sort of floppy quality. And it's all because here in the United States, books are printed long grain, with the grain running top to bottom of the page, whereas in Europe they're printed cross grain, with the grain running across. And I think the American style makes them easier to read. Anyway, that's a very roundabout way of saying that when I tend to be here in America, I have a habit of buying books. And when I was in New York, one of the ones I picked up was called American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy, by David Korn. As the title rather gives away, the book has the distinct disadvantage of there being absolutely zero sympathy between the author and the subject. Korn is clearly not a Republican. He doesn't like even moderate Republicans, and that's really quite clear throughout the book. And so his analysis is always uncharitable. And I think that's a real limitation in a political book. There's also another problem with that, which is basically if you hate every Republican and use very harsh language about them, as many people on the American left have done over the decades, what words do you have left to use when somebody you really hate comes along? And that has for many Democrats and, like I say, many people on the American left, because being what's happened with the emergence of Donald Trump. His core claim, Korn's core claim in this book, is that Trump and MAGA republicanism didn't come out of nowhere, but that its origins can be found over decades of Republican thinking and internal debate, particularly the debates in the 1950s and 60s between more moderate Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans, as some people might have thought of them, and more conservative Republicans, including those who were linked to Senator Goldwater in the 1960s. And Korn's argument is that parts of the Republican Party accept the fringe of extremists, people like the John Birch Society, who thought that President Eisenhower and other government officials were part of the wholesale communist conspiracy against the United States. And the argument is that by allowing those people within the party, by keeping them within the party, and by ultimately accepting them within the party. That the fringe of the Republican Party became emboldened and then went mainstream, and that you can draw a line from those debates right through to Trump being inaugurated and as president of the United States. And the book raises important questions, really, about how parties should deal with their fringes and how long-standing political currents sometimes influence what happens many years on. And it's certainly true, of course, that Trumpism, if that's what we end up calling this MAGA Republican phase, didn't come from nowhere. But to me, it's not just a story of saying that what people did like Ronald Reagan or William Buckley and other more conservative Republicans 5 or so decades ago was too cowardly to stand up to a certain bunch of people on the fringe and therefore embolden them many decades on. And this book would be much more compelling, to me at least, if it engaged more with the failures of the left as well as the right, and also considered a bit more the context in which the parties operate, including in the last couple of decades and last couple of years, not just the arguments that go on within the parties. But in spite of that, I think it's a very readable book. It's one I'm enjoying. It's an interesting period in American history. It raises lots of interesting questions about the American right and what's happened with it, questions which would once have seemed very alien back home in the UK, but which certain currents and trends within the British right make seem a little bit less alien today. And so it's a book that I think is worth reading and one that I'm enjoying to read, even if I don't always agree with it. So, Richard, how about you? What are you reading at the moment?
Well, I actually thought that I would recommend a book that I read some time ago, but is very appropriate given the events that will soon unfold in the United States with the end of the Biden administration in particular, and also given who we are speaking with today, our guest, Al Felzenberg. I wanted to recommend one of Al's books, The Leaders We Deserved and a Few We Didn't, Rethinking the Presidential Rating Game. Now, Al is not the first person by any measure to try to rank the presidents against each other. This has been a sport of some sort going back many decades. But what Al has done in his book, which I think helps to set it a cut above the rest of the ways in which people try to rate and rank American presidents, is to apply a degree of order, consistency, and methodological structure to the way in which presidents are rated and then ranked. And so Al comes up with several different metrics by which to rank a president and the president's administration, and that includes the president's economic policies and foreign policies, but also questions of presidential character, for example. And then Al has used that, using his vast knowledge of American history, as you heard in our interview today, to be able to generate an evidence-based number that can be used to rate and then rank the presidents. And it's a great book because I think it challenges some assumptions that we have about who were bad presidents and who were good presidents, and also, I think, reassuringly can confirm, but now with some evidence, those presidents who we view as top of the pops and those who are bottom of the pile. So I really recommend it to our listeners.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. Thank you for listening, and Al, most of all, thank you very much for being with us and for your insights. Since Attlee and Churchill premium subscribers or paid subscribers of the Since Attlee and Churchill Substack, we'll have a special bonus episode looking at the relationship between presidents and prime ministers, and that episode is available now. For everybody else, we'll be back next week when Richard and I will be back in a cold and wintry Oxfordshire to discuss another topic from post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.